In this video, we're going to have a quick look at the bar scene, which introduces the Bard character. Starts off, we've got an exterior, and I'm not dealing with exteriors, but it's a really kind of matte painted setup with this crazy like mountain thing going on. So that's kind of cool, kind of interesting, a little bit different. Quite clearly they've CGI'd this, but we can see the location that we're going to be dealing with. So it's interesting to kind of follow that through and say, well, you know, there are windows there, where's everyone's seat? So realistically, we probably aren't getting all that much direct light in there, but we'll see how they play that once we get into the scenes. As soon as we're inside, we've got a ton of level blasting onto his loot just here and the side of his face. And this is much harder, I feel, than anything we've previously seen in an interior setup where the light is falling across someone's face. To me, this feels much more like a big Fresnel HMI. So we've got hard shadows, and that's really the big giveaway here. It's either got to be a sky panel a bajillion miles away because they have a huge aperture on the front, or it's got to be a Fresnel which is throwing that light in a much more focused fashion, smaller aperture on the front of the thing, and you get those really crisp, defined shadows. And also the fall off on his face is just abrupt. It's almost a straight line. It's just pow. Calling out immediately, we've got the fire just here, not doing much. The fire compared to the level of his loot tells you everything that you need to know about that light. It's there, it's playing on the grate, it's playing a little bit on the walls, but that's it. It's really not throwing that far at all. Side of his face, I'm going to go to red. This is just crazy. So side of his face is blasted to overexposure, and we're catching all the way down his arm, across his loot just here on the fretboard, all the way up and hitting the tuning pegs, so we're getting lots of little specular on those. You can see these shadow lines as well. So just here, take that back a bit, around his cuff, got a really crisp defined shadow line between the highlight there and the shadow just there. Equally around his hand just here and just here, really crisp shadows. And of course we've already called out down the side of his face, we've just got that abrupt cut off, you know, apart from around there where he catches with his eye. So that's all being bloomed out with some haze. The light source is, let's work this angle. If his picking finger's there, yeah, I'm saying that's coming in like this, catching the tops of his hands. And just look at the shadows, how they're falling. It plays out. That lacy cuff he's got is casting a really crisp, look at the shadow on that actually. So you can see the variation in thickness of the lace on his cuff. It's such a crisp shadow. We've got a little bit playing on the pewter tankards up here. Not all that much on those. It's mostly catching that one because that one's got a little bit more shape to it and it's a little bit further that way. And then grayness just on all of this from just the haze just bleeding out and any little return that it's getting. The entire side of the frame there is just hazed and bloomed out to nothing. He changes the position of his loot. It's actually interesting because when you have a surface which is reflective, so skin is reflective, wood is reflective, everything is reflective to a certain degree. Obviously some things are far more reflective than others, but the wood of his loot is kicking that light directly at the lens. It's catching his face and his face is kicking it directly at the lens. It's just all hitting the right angle. Jump to the next frame, and he has stepped further in, but just by changing, and you see this if you watch actually it moving, you see as he moves it, it does shift, and when the light catches it at a different angle, it doesn't blow out as much. But you can still see super defined shadowing everywhere. So I would call out his fingers just here. We've got really sharp shadow line going off down the fretboard just there, and then on his fingers you've got that really sharp highlight just cutting off on each. No gentle fall off with that. What I like about the way this scene plays out as he moves through is it actually shows you the space that he's in. We see the window just here. It's a little bit clearer. It's not as blown out at this point, but we still do have all of that haze bleeding across the scene. And he moves through the space. Now that's interesting because we are jumping to a reverse shot here. He's looking at these people. It's not strictly what we're looking at with these lighting setups, but the eye lines of these people looking up to him just there. Because if they weren't looking up to him, the shot where he is looking down at them doesn't make as much sense. So he looks down at them. His body is genuflecting towards them. They're looking up at him. And we've got the headstock of his loot just here in shot. And that as a reverse shot actually works really nicely. So the light is on this side of their faces, which is correct. And they are getting a slightly softer light, I have to say. And she's getting quite a lot of return from everything going on just here. Less so with him. So he's just getting a mixture of that across his arm, across her arm down there, and quite a sharp line down there too. But definitely brighter on that side of her face. Interestingly, the headstock of the loot in his arm not really getting all that much from the fire that would be behind them. So that's really doing very little at all. And then these cups and bowls are all catching a little bit. That's catching a little bit of the candle actually. Again, huge flame on that. Probably triple wick, as we've mentioned in some of the other breakdowns. Reasonable amount of fill and not much definition. So apart from the highlight side of his face, this side just starts to disappear into the wall. You can't quite tell where his head actually stops with the hairline just there. It just sort of bleeds across into the wall, which is interesting. And he turns around, moving through the space, seeing this play out and seeing that we still got the fire in the back just there. We're establishing where everything is, where everyone is sitting. That light that we called out right at the beginning, the HMI, is now beaming all the way across and hitting the backs of these people just here, and the bench, and the floor just there. It's even playing across the fireplace. Now, because of that, it's probably at a slight angle coming in. Let's see. Yeah, it's kind of raking across a little bit here, but not loads. So we are getting it on those walls as well. Got to be a powerful light source to throw across that distance without absolutely crazy fall off. So it means it's a long way away, which means it's got to have a lot of power. So he's moving through. He's being lit with something different just here. Not entirely clear what that is. Might be another window, but it's very flat onto the camera. So we've got the pillar just here. He moves, and the camera moves, and the pillar is now on the left of frame, just here. Again, it's establishing that geography of everything that you're seeing. We still have that light coming in at the back. We can still see where the fireplace was with all the jugs and mugs and whatever going on in the back just there. We've got these shafts of light kind of defined a little bit. It's all in the haze, but you can sort of see that general shaft of light coming down. Some hot areas down here, which are catching that light full on, a little bit on the brickwork, a little bit on here, on this stonework just here. And he's being lit with something completely different now at this point. In fact, if you look at his eyes, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not one neat catch light. There are a couple of different things happening. And it's a pretty flat look on his face. It's not as modeled as other shots that we've seen where we're having dark and light. That's much flatter. The only thing which is really defined there is underneath his jaw, which means that the light isn't coming right underneath, but it is certainly not super shapely. When you have an actor moving through a space though, getting them to always have that perfect modeled look as they're moving from spot to spot is really tricky. And I feel like a lot of the shots here are actually genuinely created with the same lighting setup. Maybe a couple of little finessing movements here and there, but that's a impressive thing to be able to just say, okay, we're going to move through this space, we've lit it all, and you will be able to work and act within these zones, and you don't have to worry so much about falling out of your light. We've established his pose just here. He is in a pose. We can see very clearly his kind of, if we just sketch it out, we've got his arm down here, we've got the line of his body just there, we've got his arm going up like that, and then the headstock of the lute up to there. Everything carries across to the next frame where we see that pose played out, obviously in reverse, with body like that, got his arm there leaning against the pillar, and then lute and headstock like that. So it is the same pose. We've seen him put his leg up, and it creates this kind of wonderful silhouette. Having a really strong pose is something which normally you'd see, I don't know, like in a fight scene where you have a lot of action, and then when things stop or when you have a moment, there's a dynamic stance which tells you a lot about the character. His jaunty knee up on the footstool within this bar. We've seen fights almost happen in bars and taverns in The Witcher. It seems like a rough environment, and he's a rather jaunty fellow to be walking around singing songs and sticking his leg up. So it tells us a lot about his persona without having to do that much. Now really, he should probably be being hit with quite a lot of light down here. And he's getting a bit, but not tons. Same back of this person and some of the people around here. Because he's moved through that space, there is light falling on this, but it's not the massive, super hard light source that we saw before. In fact, now it feels like that's coming in this way. Now, because he's turned 180 degrees, it doesn't really make sense that we now have this beam of light coming in from the window by Henry Cavill just there, The Witcher, and also on this side. Got a lot of haze and atmosphere just bleeding out across the room and giving us a little bit of kind of atmospheric interest within there. Also, we are dotting candles around still, and often in little conglomerations, and they do play on them. There's just a little bit, enough of something on the people. Got some orange happening on the side of her face just here, and a little bit on the side of his face. It's got a much stronger highlight on that side of her face, and that's obviously coming from all of that just there. But yeah, we've got a decent spread of highlights and shadows throughout this, and you can see this super massive crispy shadow on the floor just there being cast from this bench, and then the shadow of the table actually falls out further than that. But that again tells you this is a really focused, hard light source. It all blends nicely because the haze, you're saying you're in this tavern environment, and because it's all meant to be candle lit and window lit, it's kind of acceptable the way that it blows out, because it would feel like that if you're looking out a really bright window in this dark space, and everything is dark. It's worth noting, in a modern environment, in a house, you probably got much lighter walls than this. This has got dark wood up on the ceiling, it's got dark wood on the floor, it's got dark stone on the walls. There isn't much to give a return, and that actually helps them to create layers within this. It's not fighting to constantly shape things, because there's naturally quite a lot of negative in this space, and when you want something to be illuminated, you've got to fire light at it, because otherwise, like the stonework in the back, it just goes off to a really dark tone. When you do shoots in more modern houses, you'll constantly be fighting against really light tones in carpet, in walls, doors. Everything you encounter will be trying to destroy your contrast ratios. At least here, they've got a fighting chance of keeping it, even though they're probably lighting the whole scene as a wide. Just remember, between that shot and that shot, we're saying that that's his back, which isn't being lit by this massive beam of light that's coming in. It's kicking hard onto them, it's kicking hard onto the floor, and I find it hard to believe that we wouldn't actually have absolutely tons of light on his back just there, but hey, cheat it, it's fine. So he finishes up his song, gets heckled, goes back over to the window, And almost that plays as a one shot. Apart from the reverse, it's actually really pretty genuine. Goes back over the window, silhouette against the haze, love it. Retreats to there, and you can just see he's blown out down one side, no information at all, just loads of haze. He notices the Witcher, and there's that super hard shadow again. A light that hard shows up all of the imperfections in the skin. So you look at his skin, you can see the little divots and dimples and texture in his skin, where before when we were looking, say, at the Sintra scene in the hall, where we've got that soft light wrapping around, completely different vibe. Really, I mean, look at his eyelashes. That's really oppressively hard because it's just picking them up, only the eyelashes, because they're sticking into that light beam. Now here we're seeing him looking towards Geralt in the corner, and that eye line actually works reasonably well. He's obviously still lit the same way. I don't really call anything out as having changed from the previous shot. He proceeds to walk back through, very similar to the shots that we were seeing him with his loot, apart from this lady passing through shot. And now we get into a slightly different angle on everything. Got the really bright window just there. This window is super bright. Again, that light bleeding with the haze out, and you see catching the table there, this is all just blown out. He's got this cool highlight giving his detail across his features. As we've noticed in other scenes, his armor is leather and it's slightly reflective, so that's catching light just there. It's actually interesting because very few items of clothing are going to be that reflective. I mean, you look at my jacket or a shirt or a jumper that someone might wear if they were in a modern setting. You don't often find, apart from like a leather jacket, people really wearing that frequently. So having that in this kind of environment where you've got candlelight and window light, it helps to have a character who's basically dressed in black, but still get some definition and detail without having to throw tons of light on it, because it does pick up that light and interact with it a bit. He's got a reasonably defined shadow just there, and that's helping to cut him out from the wall a little bit. You can see his shadow just there. He's not catching this light full on, and to be honest, actually, it seems like he's getting quite a lot of return from the table just here. So I would say that bouncing back into his face is probably doing like most of the heavy lifting. I would say that you can light this. I don't know that they definitely did, but I'd say you could light this just by firing a big light into the table. If you're happy for the table to blow out, then use that as the return for your actor. And you do actually find this a lot in films. If someone has to be sitting at a table, you can fire the light onto the table into a book or something that they're reading, and it just returns into the face and just lights them up. So it is a trick that people certainly use. Practical in the back, it's doing nothing, absolutely nothing. Now obviously they've got something going on in that window frame just there. Maybe there is some diffusion, or maybe it's just slightly frosted glass, just to make sure you're not seeing any of the outside world. He is back leaning against that post. It's a softer light on him this time, and it's got a little bit more shaping than before. I don't know whether that's because he's standing closer to... No, it can't be. They seem to have changed this because he's got a much more defined downside there, fill side. The background seems the same. These guys in the back are all the same as they were. Seeing a little bit further over this way perhaps than we did before. That's all good, and they're catching that light on their face as well. And that light is really throwing. So for him, beaming in this way, and he has got catch lights in his eyes that would correspond to that. So yeah, somewhere off frame over here, we're lighting that. I don't think it's the same that's lighting this, because that would just be tricky. I don't think that would work at all. That's coming from somewhere else. This is a lot more down as well. So I think I've got it. because he would be being lit with the window that is basically where Geralt's sitting, they've had to finesse it because otherwise it would be super hot and really flat. So instead, they're pretending like he's being lit with the other window that we saw, and this pillar is catching the full brunt of that. It's kind of weird. But looks good, it's got some shape to it. We're now seeing, because we're not completely in haze on him, it's worth just calling out that his clothing is much more vibrant now. We're really seeing those colors. We've got that kind of turquoisey, got the red obviously in there as well. So you're starting to get more of a sense of him with the lighting just here. So now we're much further around, looking at him almost flat on, and we can see here that the table is not anywhere near as blown out as it was. They have come in and they've finessed for this shot. So catchlight in his eye, just there. Give him some spectacles. Yeah, looks far more educated like that. Catchlight is relatively low, and that light is probably doing everything. Yeah, it's definitely sorting out the cup, and I think it's probably sorting him out too. That's a fairly straightforward finesse for a closer up shot. He's sitting side on the window, he's getting a much harder line on him, whereas Henry Cavill's sitting further back. We've got this awesome haze in the background, giving us a shaft coming down like that. It's very much like an old painting. You've got red sitting in the background here. You've got the green of his outfit popping him out. And then you've got this light blue, more red, and then just this cutting him out as well from that window. Another highlight on that pillar. It's a pretty nice frame, although the light on him is not super flattering. It is a lot more flattering than the previous shot where it was that hard light source coming in. See a different level on him just here as Witcher gets up, walks across the light, and the level drops on him, and indeed on the table and everything as well. It's nice, I think, for actors to be able to move through light, and a lot of the time when you're setting things up, if you don't very carefully work your ratios and very carefully work your inverse square law to give you enough leeway in your fall off, as soon as an actor steps close to the light, the level change is dramatic, and it's an instant tell. So here, if they're using bigger sources, and say they're using a couple of big HMIs at a distance, blasting through, if they're 15, 20 feet away, then they might have enough fall off within the context of this not to notice, particularly if he's 2 or 3 feet closer to that light source. Now we get an interesting little callback here to positioning. So we can see the same people, we can see the same windows that we've been seeing throughout the whole scene, and he's moving around, everyone's watching. Again, very much like a Renaissance painting this. You've got a massive bright shaft in the background, people with all kinds of different clothes on, hats. So that is the tavern scene where we introduce the bard done. Interesting one. I like the shafts of light they got going on. All the windows are at a relatively low level. There's not many high lighting sources in here. And it is interesting to see the different textures and how dark these interiors actually get, and how well they've managed to define some of those zones of light that people are moving through. There's definitely some points where the characters' faces do fall off to grey and then just dropping the IRE value on the skin right down, and they're not getting a great return. But you can see in other areas, like Our Lady just here, it's just another quick little one. She's got this light just beaming up into her face, and that is everything that's coming down here onto the table that is then just bouncing up into her face just there. Nifty little cheat. If you ever have to light someone's face, put white down on the table and bounce the light up into it, and immediately you get something. We used this when we did some filming with a school. We had to film everyone singing in the choir. All the light was going down because they had like lights on the inside of a rail. So what we got them to do was hold some white sheets of paper so that they could hold those inside their leather books and get a little bit of return into their faces. It was very effective, and it meant that we could do a wide shot, getting enough level onto their faces, and then jump in and do some close shots really quickly without having to cheat and bring in tons of other lighting. It's definitely something that's very effective, and it's something which you can apply on a much smaller scale in sort of everyday shooting environments. Even if it's documentary, you can get quite a lot of mileage out of that little trick. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope I haven't rambled too long. We're going to continue with these breakdowns, so stay tuned and do subscribe if you have not already.